tells us how much we don't know. There was once a wedding, and who was at the wedding? The Alter Rebbe. And they had a batchen. You know what a batchen is? Batchen is a joke, like a gesture. But who's going to make jokes in front of the Alter Rebbe? Not an easy task. So you know what he did? He drank. He drank a lot, so he could open up. So he turns to the Alter Rebbe, and he says, Rebbe, after a lot of thought, I decided there's no difference between you and me, between you and I. Why? He says, whatever I know, you also know. Whatever I know, you know. Whatever you don't know, I also don't know. So what's the difference? There's a couple of things you know and I don't know. But he says, but how does that compare to what you don't know? And Alter Rebbe started to cry. How does what you know compare to that which you don't know, which is infinite? He started to cry. That was his batchanas when he was tipsy. The humility that we don't know is so important. Why was this soul sent down this corridor of darkness? I don't know. And when I say the words I don't know, I choose them carefully because Esther was valedictorian of Beis Yaakov, Yerushalayim and Bnei Brak. She was also valedictorian of Beis Chama, Bnei Tzion, Beis Ruchel, Beis Rivka, Bruriya, Shulamit, and Nevei too, and Chemdas, and all the other seminaries and schools. The Shadchanim were coming after her like there's no tomorrow. Esther was creme, dala creme, the best family in Iran. It was Jewish, it was very Jewish then. And then who took her at the end? A drunkard, alcoholic, Persian Meshuggah monarch by the name of Achashverosh. And Mordechai at some point says, Esther ken, mi yodeya, im le'es kazoi sigat l'malchus. Who knows if this is not the reason you went down that place, you're going to save the Jewish people. And he says, mi yodeya. It's not something that I can understand or figure out with my cerebral brain. There's some things beyond das. And that's why, how do we celebrate Purim? Ada lo yada. The journeys of life, you will not process through a cerebral mathematical process. The journeys of life you embrace with humility, with faith, with openness, and with appreciation of the infinity of life's journeys and mysteries. So there's a Jew, he's 94 years old, or 95 years old today, lives in Petach Tikva, and his name is Rabbi Frank. And he shared the story, I heard him tell the story. Rabbi Frank was born in August 1929. His grandfather, Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem after Rav Kook passed away in 1935. Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank became the great Rav of Yerushalayim for many decades. He was a great Talmid Chacham, he was a brilliant scholar, but his heart equaled and matched his mind. He was a loving, humble, beautiful person. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, known as the Har Tzvi, very special man. He lived not far from him. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank had a grandson who was born in Chodesh Av, after Tisha B'Av, Tafresh Peites, 1929. His bris was the next Shabbos. Rabbi Pesach Frank had to be that Shabbos in Hebron for a Sheva Brachas of his family. But because his son had a baby, his daughter-in-law had a baby, and he would be the sandik at the bris, so he stayed back in Jerusalem. That Shabbos was the Hebron massacre, 17th of Av, 18th of Av, 69 Jews were axed to death by the Arab terrorists. Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank and his wife were both saved because they stayed behind in Yerushalayim for the bris of this boy who would be named Yaakov Frank, who lives in Petach Tikva today, Larichas Yom Rishonim Tovos. 94 years old, 1929, 94. 24 of the Jews murdered were students of Yeshivas Hebron, Slobodka. Reb Nosson Tzvi Finkel came in the 1920s from Lithuania and built a yeshiva in Hebron, Knesset Yisrael Hebron, Slobodka Yeshiva. 24 of the Jews murdered were yeshiva students, young boys, who were killed. One of them, a few of them were American. One of them was an American boy. And in America in the 20s, there were no yeshivas. Torah Vodaas would open a little later. Yeshiva University would open then, but there was no infrastructure of yeshivas. And he was a brilliant young man and he wanted to learn. So he asked his parents if he can go to Israel, Palestine. And they agreed, and he went to learn in Hebron. He was from Philadelphia, and he did amazingly well. In 1929, things got very, very chaotic here. There were riots, and the parents were worried for their son. So they sent a telegram to the Rosh Yeshiva, excuse me, and they asked if their son could come back. They want him back. Rosh Yeshiva asked Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank to intervene. And he said, since you have connections with communities in America, because everyone used to ask him questions in writing, do you know the rabbi of that shul in Philadelphia? Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank said, yeah. So he said, could you write him a letter and tell him that in Hebron everything is safe? Because one of the leaders of Hebron was Rebbe Eliezer Dan Slonim. He was on the council of Hebron. He was a banker. He spoke Arabic. He was very close with the Arabs. So the Jews of Hebron felt protected. In fact, when the pogrom started, they all went to his house. He had a gun. They davened there. And then somebody took away his gun and he was murdered. His wife was murdered and all the Jews in his house were murdered during Shachris. But Hebron is safe. Because Rosh Yeshiva said, Rosh Yeshiva said, to lose this boy, going back to America, we're going to lose him. And he's a budding diamond. He's a budding leader. He's charismatic and creative and wise. And we need these types of leaders. Talmidei Chachamim. So Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank acquiesced and he sent a message to the rabbi in Philadelphia. Please tell the parents Hebron is safe. They shouldn't take their boy home. And they listened. And the boy stayed in Hebron and he was murdered. And Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank could not forgive himself. He felt that literally he mixed in and he was indirectly guilty. The parents were worried. They wanted to bring this boy home. He convinced them not to bring him home. And the boy was murdered. Which means he felt he had blood on his hands. It was indirectly, obviously, and it was non-deliberate, but he felt ultimately, why did he mix in when he did not know the situation? And why did he give such advice? And he could not forgive himself. Now, he wouldn't talk a lot about it, but his grandson, Yaakov, whom because of his bris, Rabbi Tzvi Pesach was saved, with him he shared the story. He said, I was saved because of your bris, and this boy, I caused his murder. And he could never ever forgive himself. Years passed. Rabbi Yaakov Frank told the story. It's 1960. That's 30 years. The massacre was 29. So this is 31 years after the Hebron pogrom. And he's in Miluyim. He goes to the IDF. He's already 30 years old, 31 years old, and he's a reservist of the IDF 1960. And they're in training. They're doing imunim. And one night, it was a Wednesday night, they were somewhere in a field doing training, and it started to pour. And they went into the trenches, but the water was so powerful, the downpour was so intense, that the trenches filled up with water. And they were there for hours soaking. And in the trench that he went in, there was another man, also a reservist, who went into the same trench. So now they're both soaked. The floods are coming down. They're drenched to the core of their bones. They're freezing. But they're there in the middle of the night in some place. So you start talking to each other. Shalom Aleichem, what's your name? What's your name? Yaakov Frank. Yaakov Frank, grandson of Rabbi Tzvi, Jewish geography. The great Kabbalist Jackie Mason. He's the guy who repeated my jokes. So Jackie Mason once said, if two Jews meet and within 3 minutes they don't establish a family connection, one of them is not Jewish. So he says, Jacob Frank, yeah, you're the grandson of Pesach Frank. He says, yeah. So he says to him, wow, how is your grandfather doing? He's great. And they're talking, what do you do? He says, I'm a historian of the Yishuv HaYehudi Be'eretz Yisrael Lifnei Kum HaMedina. I'm a historian of the Yishuv in Israel before the state was established in 48. So he starts talking about the Hebron pogrom and how he saved his grandfather because he was a sandik at his bris. And then he tells me, my grandfather is still brokenhearted because of that Slabotke Hebron boy who was murdered. So this historian looks at him, they're in the trenches. And he says, do you know the end of the story? He says, what end of the story? The boy was dead. The boy was killed. What's the end of the story? He says, there's another part to the story. He says, I never knew. So he says, well, this father, the father of the boy who was slain, was a big macher in Philadelphia. He was a diplomat, and he was very close to many politicians in the State Department. And he made a ruckus. He went to the State Department and he says, it's the British who are guilty. Because how did they stop the Hebron pogrom? The British came and they shot. And the rioters left because the rioters didn't have live ammunition. They used knives, they used hatchets, they used axes. And when the British started to shoot, they all ran away. Why couldn't the British shoot early Shabbos morning? Why couldn't they shoot Friday night? They let it happen. They were accomplices to the murder of these Jews. And he made such a commotion in the State Department, they put pressure on the British, and they replaced the commander of the British presence, the British mandate, the one in charge, and they sent a military man by the name of Arthur Wakaf. He was sent by the British to replace the leader of the British authority mandate here in Palestine, Arthur Wakaf. And the man says to Jacob Frank, Arthur Wakaf started to travel the land. Thank you. And when he started to travel the land, he fell in love with Israel. He fell in love with them. He liked the Jewish people. And he came here in 1931, and his tenure continued to 1937. And during his tenure, he opened up the gates, and he allowed anyone who wanted to immigrate to Israel. And because of that, close to 400,000 Jews could come here. In fact, because of him, he says, when Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933, many German Jews and Austrian Jews could come here, and many other Jews from Eastern Europe made Aliyah because he opened the doors. And not only that, he quadrupled the ability of Jews to own territory, to own assets, to own ground and earth in Israel, almost 5 times the amount, and he almost quadrupled the number of Jews living in Israel. When he came here, there were around 150,000 Jews, and then when he was done in 1937, he was gone officially because of an illness. Some say he was fired, whatever it is. The number was much, much higher. And he looks at Jacob Frank, he says, I just want you to realize one thing. In 1948, during the Independence War, there were 600,000 Jews here. 1% of them were killed. 6,000 Jews were killed in the War of Independence. But if not for Arthur Wakaf, there wouldn't have been 600,000 Jews. There would have been much, much, much less. And there was no way, naturally, they could win any war. So just realize that despite the horrible, horrible tragedy, that story caused Arthur Wakaf to come to Israel. And because of that, today they can build a country of Israel, and 200,000 Jews were saved from Auschwitz because they could come here during those years. So we don't know why that boy was killed, but we should just realize that the whole Israel and hundreds of thousands of Jews owe their life to that boy because of what happened. Jacob Frank was stunned. It's 1960. He said, my grandfather never heard the end of the story. Nobody ever told this to him. Nobody knew it. I have to tell this to him. He says, go ahead. At that point, it was 3 a.m, and the commander said, listen, this training is not going anywhere because this rain is not stopping. You can all go home. You have an early chafesh, sof shavua, go home. And they're drenched. They say, Baruch Shepatrani, they go home. He comes home. He was exhausted, he was tired. He tells his wife, Yaakov tells his wife, they had a baby. He tells his wife, Ani noseya miyad l'Saba. I'm going right away to Saba, to Rabbi Pesach Frank. She says, you go visit him every Shabbos. Every Shabbos after davening, he walked an hour and a half to go visit his grandfather. He says, no, I have to go now. I said, what do you have to go? I have to tell him something. She says, go. He comes Thursday to his grandfather. Rabbi Pesach Frank greets him and says, I thought you were in Sahal. What happened? So he tells him the story. They were soaked, and the commander said they can go home, and I wanted to come here. He says, why do you have to come here? You're coming Shabbos anyway. He said, I have to tell you something. He says, what do you want to tell me? Before you tell me, first a cup of tea. He puts up the kettle. He gives himself and his grandson a cup of tea. He says, Yaakov, tisaper. And he tells his grandfather the whole story of what he just heard in the trenches about the consequences of the death of that boy and how it changed history in Israel. So Pesach listens, and he says, wow, I never knew this. Literally, you just took a stone that was on my chest for 31 years, and you removed it. And he said, you know, I'll never forgive myself for what I did, but I realized that there's things I just don't know, and stories have continuations in ways that people don't know. And he thanks him, and he walks him to the door, and he says, I want to tell you something. You didn't have to bother and leave your wife and child when you're anyway coming for Shabbos. You didn't have to. But I will never be able to thank you enough for the fact that you rushed right over here and you told the rest of the story. And he escorted him out, he gave him a kiss, and he said shalom, and he left. Shabbos morning, this was his custom every Shabbos morning, Yaakov Frank finished davening, then he walked an hour and a half to go to visit his Saba and say Shabbat Shalom. On the way, he passed his brother-in-law's house. His brother-in-law comes out and says, you don't have to go. He says, why not? He says, Saba passed away. Shabbos, 8 o'clock in the morning. It was Shabbos told us, Chaf Aleph Kislev. Chaf Aleph Kislev, Tovshin Chaf Aleph. December 1960. Rabbi Pesach Frank passed away suddenly at the age of 87. This week is his yahrzeit, and he just passed away 2 hours ago. There's nowhere to go. Yaakov Frank was stunned. The next day was the funeral. Mitzvah Shabbos was the funeral. 1977. There's a mahapecha, there's a revolution in the Israeli government. For the first time, it goes from the left to the right, and Menachem Begin becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. Some of you may even remember it. Till then, Israel belonged to the left. Menachem Begin, who was always in the opposition, became the Prime Minister of Israel. Who did he hire? And one of his people was Yaakov Frank. And he was in charge of helping build the territories in Yehuda and Shomron. Menachem Begin sent him to the United States of America to do some work on this behalf of the Jews living in those areas and building up the Shtachim. And in the process, he told him to go visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So in 1977, Yaakov Frank came to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brooklyn. He went in, he introduced himself. The Rebbe asked him, of course, the Jewish question, are you related to Rabbi Pesach Frank? And he said, I'm his grandfather. And he said, the Rebbe looked at him and said, Tisaperli al Saba. Tell me stories about your grandfather. So he told the Lubavitcher Rebbe about his grandfather. And the Rebbe says, Od Sipur, tell me another story. Tell him another story. Od Sipur. Kept on asking him for more stories. And finally he said, and tell me one more story. So he decided to tell this story. And he told this story. The Rebbe listened. And when he finished, the Rebbe looked at him and he said, I want to tell you something. I always tell my students, and I always tell anybody who listens to me, that when you have an opportunity to do something good, don't delay it. Because mimanavshach, any way you look at it, it doesn't make sense to delay it. If it's something that's not worth doing, then you shouldn't do it even in 6 months. And if it's something that's worthwhile doing, then do it today. Don't do it tomorrow. Don't do it in 2 hours. Do it now and do it today. And he says, look, if you would have waited for Shabbos to tell your grandfather this story, you would have never forgiven yourself. You would have never forgiven yourself. And your grandfather would go to the next world with this heaviness. Because you had the conviction, mitzvah balayotcha altach mitzvah zrizes, vayashkem Avram baboiker, to go now and go right now. So look what happened. Your grandfather died that Shabbos morning, a day later, with a sense of peace. And you had that sense of peace. How grateful you are to yourself for doing that. He said, look at this lesson. When there's something good to do it now. As Rabbi Yaakov shared this story, I thought to myself, here you see the words of Mordechai, mi yoidea, ad lo yada. Who understands people's journeys? Who understands where souls have to end up? When you look at yourself, or you look at different souls, especially the souls of your loved ones, and you see that they're on journeys, sometimes very complicated ones, and very difficult ones, and very painful ones, it's very easy to go into a place of guilt, and shame, and self-loathing, and negativity, and toxicity, and blame this one, and blame that one. But we really have to have the humility, and the awareness that we don't know. We don't know and understand journeys. We don't know mysteries. What we do know is every soul has its mission, its shlichus. Mi yoidea. And if I can embrace that and realize that the places I ended up in, and the places I went to, and even the mistakes I made, and things that happened to me, were not random. They weren't just tragic stories that created so many complications, but rather, like Yosef, they were opportunities for unbelievable growth, even if it came with pain, because there's something that happened as a result. There's something you took out from that experience. There's something you have because of that the world needs. There is a light that God wanted you to retrieve from the darkness, and it's why He took you down that path. And the world needs that light today. This, then, is what the Baal Shem Tov and the Baal HaTanya taught. Never see yourself only as a victim, because remember these three things. Number one, the soul can never be damaged, ever. It's as infinite and as bright as eternity itself. Number two, even the challenges and negativity I'm dealing with are husks, they're shells, they're protectors. Like Yosef, be curious, and you will see that your crushes, your addictions, your anger, your garbage, your complicated stuff, not only should you not be ashamed of them, but with tenderness and compassion, ask them what they need. Ask them what they're looking for, so you can heal your animal consciousness, so you could heal your reptilian brain, so you could bring God into all the parts of yourself, so you could bring oneness into all the parts of yourself, so you could bring in consciousness into all the parts of yourself. And number three, remember that even in those moments of darkness, you were never alone. God was with you, holding your hand. And like Yosef, remember that in life sometimes you feel like you were buried. And you have good proof for it. People have been throwing lots of sand and earth over you. And Yosef was the first one who knew what it felt like, because he was thrown into a pit not once, but twice. Once by his brothers, and the other time by Potiphar's wife. What was his secret? His secret is he realized he was not buried. He was planted. When you plant a seed, technically you bury it. But you're not burying it, it's planted. And suddenly, a few years later, Tzadik Atama Yifrach, Ke'erez Balvona Yizgem. The problem is, Haboy Reik Ein Boy Moyim. In order for seeds to blossom, you need water. Joseph's pit didn't have water, but it had a different type of water. The Torah says Jacob didn't stop crying. Vayevko Yisei Aviv. His father's tears, the tears that represented the fact that I believe in this boy and I don't believe he's dead, and I will not stop thinking about him because he's not dead, he's alive. Those tears irrigated the cistern, the pit where Joseph was buried so that he could be planted. In fact, it says so clearly in Tehillim, Hazorim B'dima. Who was planted with tears? You know anybody that was planted with tears? Yes, Yosef. Berina Yiksayu. Halech Yelech Uvachai. Noise Meshech Hazara. The man who was carrying the sheaves, who dreamt about the sheaves bowing down to him, ultimately became the man who gave those sheaves to the whole world and sustained them in the famine and sustained his own family. Where did these sheaves grow from? They grew from the tears of a father who would not stop believing in his child, of a father who would not become disconnected from his child, of a father who always knew the power of his child and believed in his child so that the child could believe in himself. Those tears, with Joseph's confidence that God was with him, allowed him to transform burial into plantation. And the pit became a wellspring of growth, of awareness that transformed civilization. The word Yosef means growth. And hence, it's why the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, which highlight these ideas again and again and again, can oxygenate a generation and allow people to switch on the light in yourself that not only represses darkness, but sublimates and transforms darkness as a preparation for the complete oneness. A oneness that means we can show up to life and relationships and Yiddishkeit with our full hearts and our full souls and our full passion as the oneness is revealed in the world. Hashem Echad U'Shmoi Echad. Thank you.